Now we have touched on functional components several times, starting with our app.js or our app component, which is the primary orchestrating component within our application. And then we moved to our to-do list component, and the to-do list component also is a functional component because all it does is displays a list of components or a list of to-do item display components. And then we move to our to-do item display component, which also is just a functional component. And when we learned about functional components, we learned that there were several questions we needed to ask to determine if a component should be functional or if it should be stateful. And this screencast is where we're going to get into stateful components. If we go to our user interface that we mocked up, when we were determining what needed to be stateful or functional in terms of components, we outlined our mockup and we determined what the actual components were going to be. So let's do that again really quick so that we can see what our components are going to be or have been. Now we already created a to-do item component which would sit in here, and we decided that it only displays the to-do item information. Really didn't manage its own state, didn't create its own data, and didn't manage its own data, and we didn't need to worry about its lifecycle events when it's created, updated, or deleted. For that, we made it functional. We did the exact same thing for the to-do list because really it was only responsible for displaying a list of to-do item displays based on a list of to-do items that it received from the parent application. We also decided that the parent application at this point in time, being that we're using dummy data, is also a functional component. It has a list of to-do items inside of it. It's just dummy data. It doesn't manage them. It doesn't do anything with it. It's just inside of it. So because of that, we really don't have, it doesn't meet any of the other criteria to make it more than just a functional component at this point in time. But in our application, in our design right here, we do have a component that meets a lot of the criteria for it to be more than just a functional component. And that is going to be the create new to-do item component right down here in blue. When we're trying to decide if something should be a stateful component rather than a functional component, those questions that we ask are going to be, will it need to create data, capture data from the user, or capture user events? And for this component, the answer to each of those is yes. Yes, it will create data. It will create a new to-do item. Will it capture data from the user? The answer is yes. We have a form here to capture the name and description of that new to-do that will be created. And will it capture events generated by the user? The answer is yes, because when we click on this save button, an event will be kicked off that comes from the user or was initiated by the user. Another question we ask ourselves is, will we need to manage the lifecycle events for this component? And the answer is yes, we will need to know when it is created, especially when it's updated, when the state gets changed, when these fields get typed in, and then when it gets deleted. We may want to make sure that whatever's in here actually gets saved, even if the user didn't click save when the application gets closed. So we do need to know about its lifecycle events. And being that it is responsible for creating a new to-do item, it will be in charge of managing that to-do item within its state. So it begins to have state. And with all of those questions pretty much a yes, this component right here will need to be a stateful component. So we are going to treat it as a stateful component, which means we are now going to create our first stateful component in our application. And just like we've done with the other ones, go ahead and close all of these so we've got a clean window. We're going to go ahead and create a new component over here inside of our components folder. And we, of course, are going to follow the same naming convention. Instead of messing them up, we're going to do camel case. And this will be our to-do item create component. And then within this folder, we're going to go ahead and create a new file. And that new file is going to be a, let's make sure we capitalize it, a to-do item create.js. And then we're most likely going to need its own CSS file. So we're going to add the .css to it. Make sure we capitalize. All right. Now we've got our CSS for our new stateful component, and we have a file to hold our stateful component. Now the difference between a stateful component and a functional component is that instead of it simply being a JavaScript function like we've done in the past, it is now going to be a class-based component using the ES6 class syntax in JavaScript. Now before we can do that, of course, we need to do some imports. We need to make sure we get React imported into our component. So let's go ahead and close the CSS for now. So we just have our component up here. And just like we did in our app.js, we're just going to go ahead and import React right at the top of our file. And in addition to React, we are going to use a component that lives inside of React. It's going to be the class or the functional constructor, the constructor function that creates a new React stateful component. And we're going to use that from within React. So importing React is the first thing we need to do. Now, instead of using function, we're going to use the class-based syntax out of JavaScript. And we're going to say class. And of course, this is our to-do item create component. And it extends React.component. This is the primary difference between a functional component, as we have seen inside of our app.js, right down here, where it's just a function, and a class-based component, is the fact that we use the class syntax and that it extends the actual component class that's found inside of React. With this, we get some additional functionality that we don't get in a functional component. We get the ability to have a constructor. And inside that constructor, of course, just like a functional component, it is going to take in a props object. This allows our new component to still receive props, which means it can still get attributes passed to it from within JSX, wherever it's used. So we maintain that functionality from a functional component. Now, every time you do a constructor and you accept props, you have to send the props to the super. And if you remember from JavaScript, super would be the React component that our to-do item create extends from. So we need to pass the props to the component so that the component has access to the props, just like our to-do item create component has access to the props. So always just make sure you add props whenever you're creating a stateful component. The next thing that we get when we have a class-based stateful component is we receive the state object, or the ability to have state. And we set it up with an initial state, which is this.state equals, and then a JavaScript object literal. Now let's talk a little bit about state here. State is referred to as the state of our component. In other words, when we have data that this component is in charge of, it should be inside of state. And it should be within state that we are managing this data that might be added, updated, or deleted, or modified as our component lives, or while our component is on the screen. And if we go back to our mockup, we know that in HTML forms, when you click on name and you start typing, data is going to be modified in here. It'll be added and modified. And with that, it's probably the best place for this would be somewhere inside of our component's state. And the same thing goes for description. It needs to be stored in state because it can be added, updated, modified, or deleted during the life of this component. And with that, we're going to go ahead and set the initial state of this for a name. And of course, to begin with, it's going to be empty, and a description. And it will be empty to begin with as well. And that is because we have decided that a name and a description are what make up a to-do item. So name and description. So those are going to be stateful. We want to record those as they get added, updated, modified, and deleted as our component takes care of that. And that right there shows that we have a state that our component will be in control of. Our component will be responsible for this state object. And with that, we don't want to modify this state object directly. We want to modify it indirectly by letting our component know that we need to change the state. And we're going to find out how to do that later on. So with that, we have the initial part, or the initial setup of our class-based component or stateful component. The next important part of a stateful component is, of course, the same part that it was important inside of a functional component, and that is to return something to render. In other words, we need to return the user interface that will be displayed to the user. Now in a function, because when we call a function, it's going to return something, we simply have this return that returns an executable JSX block. Here, it's not a function, so it doesn't get called and then immediately execute. Instead, we have a render method on this class object, this class-based component, and within this render function, we will call the return and pass back our executable JSX block. And so to set that up, let's add our default with a class name, and then let's go ahead and give it a name. It is going to be our to-do item, going to snake case again, to-do item dash create. And that's going to be the class for it and the div. And now we have ourselves the setup of our class-based stateful component with state and props. So this is what we get in addition to a regular functional component. And now we've got a render method that will get called in order to render the actual UI of this component. And with that, let's just go ahead and put some text in here. This is the create new to-do item component. Now we've got something that we can actually see that will be rendered. And let's go ahead and use this component right now before it gets any more complex. Now, being that based on this mockup we have, it sits underneath the list, the to-do list, we're going to put it down here, which means we are going to be importing it here into our app because it's going to sit right here under our to-do list. So first things first, we need to import it. So let's do an import. And we are going to import our to-do item create from, and then we are going to go to our components. We're going to go to our to-do item create, and we are going to pull in our to-do item create JavaScript. Let's make sure we typed everything the same. To-do item create, to-do item create. And now we can add that component in the form of JSX by adding a to-do item create right there. Go ahead and save it. And we see we've got a fail right here. We've got an error on our to-do item create. Does not contain a default export. Yep. We imported React. We created our component, but we never did our default. So let's do our export default. Make sure we export the component. Now everything compiles. If we go to our browser, we should now be able to see our create component right down here, ready for us to implement some more sophisticated functionality inside of it. And then of course that more sophisticated functionality will be adding form input fields, a save button, handling the updating of these input fields, as well as handling the updating of, or the creation of, the new to-do item when the save button is clicked. So we'll go ahead and stop right there, and we'll move on to a more detailed review of the anatomy of a stateful component in the next screencast.